And I can't hope to equal that. But I do think that when you look at the importance of the European Union as a global trading bloc, you need to start close at home. And close at home for British business means Europe's single market, a market of 550 million people to whom we can export our goods and services. And all of the figures show that this remains our biggest market, our most important market. If you look at the figures for the third quarter of 2013, our exports to the European Union had increased by nearly 2%, whereas exports to countries outside the Union fell by 8.6%. So our trade is still primarily focused. Our biggest market is still the market closest to us. And the United Kingdom, of course, has been a big proponent and supporter of the single market. It recognizes that there is more to be done. But if all of the remaining barriers to trade within the European Union are dismantled, the UK believes that its GDP could be boosted by up to 7%. So at home, there is still work. Looking further afield, is membership of the European Union an advantage or a drawback when it comes to trade policy? Now, I think it's recognized that were we not members of the European Union, the United Kingdom would be free to negotiate free trade agreements, trade and investment agreements with partners throughout the world. That's not disputed as a legal fact. I think the question is, would it be in a position to be able to do so? And would it significantly affect its export performance? If you look, and the big question is this an either or really? If you look again at the figures, the UK has, while still being a member of the European Union, more than doubled its exports to China and India in the last 5 years. But its current level of exports remains simply at 1/4 of what Germany manages to export under the same conditions. So there is a big divergence between member states of the European Union. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, would being freed from the constraints of negotiating within the European Union make any difference? I think the Foreign Secretary has recognized that a negotiation with 28 people sitting, as it were, on the second row is a ponderous exercise. It's difficult to arrive at common positions to take into the negotiation with third parties. But of course, and these are William Hague's words, when it is successful, it's of enormous importance. The recent free trade agreement with South Korea, for example, eliminated nearly 97% of tariffs between South Korea and the European Union. So when we win big. What are the alternatives for the United Kingdom? Well, for example, when talking about TTIP, only last month, American officials made it clear that were the UK to exit the European Union, there would not be a great deal of appetite in Washington for negotiating a similar agreement as besides the TTIP, simply on a bilateral basis with the United Kingdom. If we were to become members of the European Economic Area as an alternative to membership of the European Union, I think the UK would find itself, as have the countries who are members of the EEA, tending to follow the European Union into similar agreements. But there is a time lag. Usually it is the European Union which blazes a path and the EFTA follow. And finally, is the Commonwealth an alternative? Well, the Commonwealth is 54 countries, 3 of which are in the European Union. They do offer an alternative pole of interest for the United Kingdom, shared by language. But most of those countries are not the emerging economies, only 2 of them at the most, India and South Africa, and 94% of their population is found in countries in Asia and Africa, which are still very much emergent economies. So I'm not sure that offers an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And if you saw from the panel, we are going to have a very lively debate because there's already some disagreement, which we will get to. So, William, don't worry. We are going to hear your voice very loud and clear very soon. Matt, you're going to give us another short opening address. Thank you very much. Matt is the director of Open Europe.
I better be quick and get the heck out of the way because I can tell this is the panel is sort of gearing up to be quite intense and lively. Some people can't contain themselves quite, so it's going to be interesting to see. Thanks, Björn. Where are you? There. Thanks very much for doing this with us. When two Swedes get together and organize something, success is the only option. We know that, and I'm glad that we're doing this again. And thanks, Jacqueline, as well for your introductory remarks. Now, there are two views, sort of polarized views in this debate about whether it makes sense for Britain to be part of a larger trading bloc, both in terms of internal trade and external trade. One view, which is sort of over here, I suppose, or over there, I don't know, would state something like, if Britain withdrew from the EU, then no one would ever do business with Britain ever again. Britain would overnight transform into North Korea and would never strike a bilateral deal with any other country or trading bloc. There's another polarized view who say, no, actually, that's not true. If Britain withdrew from the EU, we would turn into Hong Kong on day 2. We would magically remove every single regulatory and tariff-related cost and become a free-trading, happy nation, striking deals, particularly the Commonwealth, and live happily ever after. Of course, the right view is the one that Open Europe has, as usual, which is somewhere in the middle, saying that, yes, it makes sense for the UK to be part of a greater trading bloc, to trade across borders, and the best option is for the UK to stay in a heavily reformed European Union, but being part of that bigger trading bloc does come with benefits. Now, having said that, there is a trade-off, of course, and that trade-off, which I think Jacqueline actually set out in a quite intellectual, honest way, involves you trade basically mass and clout for flexibility and swiftness. And that's a trade-off that is, I mean, that's a fact, that trade-off is there. That trade-off makes sense, I think, as long as Britain, in this particular instance, but we talk specifically about Britain, can take advantage of growing growth opportunities around the world. Then that trade-off makes sense. But there clearly are cases where Britain would like to strike trade deals with the rest of the world, and it's currently held back by, for example, special interest around, say, agriculture, as a random example, or audiovisual, for example, in the case of TTIP, or GMOs, which could be another issue around TTIP. So that trade-off is what we have to watch. And I think that actually makes it quite interesting to talk about what happens next, because I think the trade-off is worth it at the moment, but the question is what happens next. Can the EU act as a facilitator of global trade? Can the EU, for example, strike a trade deal with the United States of America? And that, I think, will be a key question. If the EU resorts to internal and external protectionism, then I think the case for Britain remaining a member will be radically weakened. Now, I'm actually quite hopeful. I think economic realities are catching up to Europe. And one of the encouraging things in this crisis is that the European Commission, and I'm not saying this lightly, is probably more liberal than the sum of its parts. And that's important. What's also encouraging is that in a time of crisis and economic downturn, what usually happens is that countries return to protectionism. That has not quite happened yet, and I think the European Commission has been a quite important counterforce to defensive responses to an economic downturn. So those are encouraging things, but let's not be complacent. If, for example, and make no mistake about this, if, for example, the EU does not strike that trade deal with the US, TTIP, then I'll bet you that the calls in this country for Britain leaving the EU will be strengthened radically. Because the argument here will be, we cannot even strike a trade deal with our precious special partner, the United States. So pay attention to that TTIP thing in particular. It's so much more than a trade deal. It's about Britain's very future in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now, before we get going, let me just introduce the panel for people who don't know. On my far left, your far right, is William Dartmouth, who's the UKIP MEP for the southwest of England. He was a former Conservative peer. 2007 you joined UKIP and left the Conservative Party.
Exactly.
To my left, your right is Vicky Pryce, economist, former joint head of the government's economic service and author of the recent book Prisonomics. To my right and your left, I have Dr. Syed Kamal, who's very recently become the leader of the Conservative delegation in the European Parliament. And on my far right is Stephen Adams, who's a partner at Global Counsel. He's a former policy advisor to Peter Mandelson when he was the EU Trade Commissioner, and also special advisor to Peter as well when he was the business secretary. Now, I'm just going to give one or two facts which we don't have to have an argument about before we get into our argument. One is that we know that for the UK, trade is extremely important. Imports and exports account for around 60 to 70% of GDP, depending whether you do it on a nominal or a real basis. In the latest OBR forecasts from last week, we saw things going on like our VAT system. The amount of fraud seems to have doubled again, which is obviously so it really matters for us as a country what's going on in trade. Things haven't been great. Our export market share has fallen by 25% between 1998 to 2013. That's just a fact in all of our export markets. And the forecasts are that our export market share will continue to decline over the next 5 years or so ahead. Our current account deficit, though, we shouldn't pretend that this is an absolutely dire state of the world. Has been not great. We've had a 3% deficit, and that's been remarkably stable for very many years. But one thing we can say is that having sterling outside any sort of restrictions, the devaluation we had in 2007, 2008, I think everyone would say has been disappointing in terms of trying to improve that current account deficit. No one really understands particularly why that's the case, and everyone still thinks the currency devaluation will ultimately help Britain's recovery. But we still haven't seen it yet. So those are some facts. The really interesting things are this is really not a debate about facts, it's a debate about counterfactuals. What would have happened had we taken a different decision? What might happen if we do take a big decision to leave the EU in the years ahead? And that's why you can't just resort to facts and just say that proves anything. We do need to hear viewpoints. So I'm just going to start with Vicky and just say, if we split the session sort of into an assessment of where we are at the moment and do that for a little bit and then move to what could happen in the future. What's your sense, Vicky, of where is Britain, given that we've had 40 years of membership of the EU and 40 years of being part of a global trading pact? Where would we be had we not been, had we had the flexibility to negotiate trade deals by ourselves?
Well, that's a big question, of course. We don't know whether we would have been able to negotiate trade deals. But of course, I mean, the climate has changed. I mean, the first thing to mention is that we are a nation that depends hugely on trade, of course. But trade globally has not been growing anything like as fast as you would expect at the time of recovery. And that's a puzzle in itself. And of course, it has affected the growth for all countries because trade is so crucial, international trade, to getting the world economy moving. Of course, what we've seen is a lack of finance for trade, quite a lot of concern about sort of banking systems in different countries and a mistrust. But it still remains a bit of a puzzle as to why it is that, in fact, trade is not recovering anything like as fast as it should be. Let's hope it does, because we do rely on it to get the growth that we want to get. Let's hope then it does. What does it give, if you like, for us for the future? But your question was, what would have happened before? But we are in a position, nevertheless, that we need to bear in mind that things have changed in the sense that we were all relying on the WTO, and therefore it does matter what happens in the future to a considerable extent. To sort out all those multilateral deals that we were all hoping were going to be in place right now. Of course, there has been success in terms of reducing tariffs internationally for goods, but not necessarily moving in the non-tariff barrier area on services. And there is an argument that, given that the WTO had achieved a number of things in the past, any of those deals that the EU has been involved in don't matter all that much, or we could have done ourselves, quite a lot of good by just having some extra things arranged with each country, because after all, we have the WTO as an arbiter, if you like, of disputes, and things have been liberalising and opening up anyway. The reality, of course, is different. That what has been happening is that WTO has achieved only a limited amount of progress. Although the Doha round sort of collapsed. There's been a bit of a movement in terms of trade facilitation recently. In the last few days, we've seen at least something happening that is helping the developing countries. But what has happened, because the WTO has not achieved its aims, is this increase of bilateral deals. And those are the name of the game now. And they are, frankly, a second-best solution. They're not guaranteeing any free trade movement across the world for countries. But what they are doing instead is they have been pushing us for quite some time, and the UK has been part of that, of course, because of the EU, to try and have the best bilateral deals, which are not ideal, but at least give us some way forward. Now, without us being a member of the EU, in my view, as those deals have been negotiated, and there are a number that have been negotiated quite successfully, we would have had absolutely no clout to achieve those changes that we hope would be happening, so that actually our trade can flow freely.
Do you think, just very briefly, do you think that Britain's trade patterns have been significantly distorted or moved by being much more focused on European countries because of our membership of the EU, or would it be rather similar had we had the flexibility to be outside?
What the EU has done is it has allowed us to export an awful lot more to Europe, because it has taken away some of the actual barriers to trade across the continent. That's been fantastically good for us. What, of course, that does is it allows companies to expand. It allows them to become more productive. It allows them to have economies of scale, so the standard stuff that you see. Plus, it gives them a lot more experience of exporting. So actually, you're in a much better position to do deals with other countries as an individual company. So it isn't a distorting impact, because obviously you want to trade with whoever is next to you. But what it does is it makes you export ready and much more capable, therefore, of doing things elsewhere. Nothing has stopped us from doing business with the BRIC countries if we wanted to, or the Commonwealth countries, except for some restrictions. Obviously we can't have the bananas that we want to have. But in reality, it has given us huge ability to do an awful lot more if we wanted to.
Okay, so your case is essentially it's facilitated British companies to trade and to be a bigger force in global trade. William, why don't you give us the counter-argument?
I'd like to start off by making two... I'm going to be very short, by the way. I'm going to start off by making two basic facts. Fact number one. Last year, 2012, according to Eurostat, China exported 289,927 million euros worth of goods to companies and countries in the member states of the EU. A second and confirmatory fact. Last year, Switzerland exported 5.6 times per capita what we did in the UK to member states of the EU. The fact of the matter is, you do not have to be in a political union in order to trade. And this phrase which you hear about the 3 million jobs, which I'm surprised that we didn't hear from the person who opened this, very interesting opening speech from a paid staff official, by the way, and I think inappropriate, is absolute piffle. It is the proposition that all trade is going to cease if we leave the European Union. The facts demonstrate that is clearly not the case. Now, the second fact...
Just to be clear, Jackie said exactly the same point, so in fact you agree with her 100% on that.
Well, that's wonderful. That's very soothing. But in the world of Westminster politics, you will find that it is that the proposition, or the implicit proposition, is bandied around that all trade would cease. I mean, you go along and people say, we can't leave the European Union because we have to be able to trade. China... Switzerland, 5.6 times per capita what we did. China, 298,000 million, which is about 80% of what we export. The second point is this. It is often also, it's the stay in the European Union or else point. According to the WTO, we're members of the WTO. Everyone is members of the WTO. Not everyone, not quite everyone, but Russia became a member of the WTO. According to WTO rules, it is not possible for our colleagues, former colleagues in the European Union, our supposed friends, to institute penal and arbitrary tariffs against us in the event that we leave. And then we're talking about trade and trade agreements. It's very easy to get sidetracked into endless discussions about trade agreements. And actually, as a member of the Trade Committee of the European Parliament, you spend an enormous amount of time talking about trade agreements. But trade agreements is only one facet of it. We're really talking about our relationship with the European Union. And the fact of the matter is that about 10% of our exports, about 10% of our gross domestic product are currently exports to the European Union, on which incidentally we actually run a huge trade deficit. But because we're members of the political union, 100% of our gross domestic product is subject to EU regulation. Now, we in this country, we institute and execute EU regulation. In places like Romania, Greece, and even France and Spain, they actually very often don't. And the calculation is, and obviously it's approximate because all these things are, that the costs of EU regulation to our economy is approximately 10% of GDP. And that is the glittering prize, if, and I hope, when we leave.
I mean, there are many... There are many estimates of those sorts of regulatory costs, and I think we're going to try and keep off some of these
but that is
regulation.
The overall context. And it's very easy to get sidetracked in endless discussion about Andorra's relationship with the European Union.
When we talk about where Britain might leave, that's the one I think we can come back to that. So your basic point is that other countries can trade.
Other countries do trade.
Can and do trade, and I don't think anyone here on the panel, let me just check, disagrees with that. So everyone, this is very good. We're getting some agreement here. And it's not possible to have penal tariffs if you leave, and I think people would tend to agree with that. You didn't actually address Vicky's point, which is because this is really about trade-offs. So, you know, as Matt said at the beginning, these aren't black and white issues. Why don't I just try and challenge you to say, is there anything Britain gets from being part of, has got from being part of the EU and as a global trading bloc? Is there anything at all you can think that, if you wanted to admit there were trade-offs rather than it was just black and white?
Well, let me make one point which is very often forgotten. When we joined the EU in 1975, we turned our back on the existing trade agreements which we had with Commonwealth countries. Now, the EU is currently seeking to negotiate trade agreements with 12 countries. 3 of those are Commonwealth countries, including India, who we had trade agreements with before we joined in 1975. So when you ask that question, it's a bit like, I think there's a very short answer to that is, give me a week and I may think of something.
OK. Said, can you answer that question? What do we get?
I agree with the point that it's trade-offs. If you look at there's some advantages to being part of a bloc of 28 countries. It does give you that sort of clout, sometimes more psychological than real, being a big bloc. There are also some downsides. One of the downsides, as a European Commission official admitted to me when we were in an exchange of views in the International Trade Committee, he said these agreements are not just about trade. We want to encourage regional integration. We would rather do block-to-block agreements rather than block-to individual country agreements. And the other thing that we have to admit about being members of the EU when it comes to trade negotiations is that we can only go as far or as fast as the most protectionist country will allow us to go. Now, there are no points for guessing who that most protectionist country might be, and it's not always the country that rhymes with chance. It is also sometimes Poland, and particularly when it comes to agricultural interests. So, it's the interesting contrast between sort of British politics wanting a black and white answer, and if you like European politics, where you see all the sorts of shades of grey. It very much depends.
How do you see the balance?
How do I see the balance? I mean, there are times when I get incredibly frustrated with the fact that colleagues from other EU countries are holding up what I think can be a very good trade agreement. And that gets incredibly frustrated. You know, for example, TTIP, the French have already started saying that they want exceptions for cultural services. Quite often, agriculture holds up a lot of trade agreements. But to be fair, it's not just EU bilateral agreements. Agriculture holds up a lot of agreements at the WTO level as well. But the other thing that I find frustrating, but you get this anyway in trade, and I say this as someone who, I should say, who used to be an academic in foreign investment and trade and worked in business before I became a politician, is that sometimes we make the mistake and we think that trade is about trade agreements and trade negotiations. Actually, the biggest myth in trade is that countries trade with each other. Countries do not trade with each other. It is people in businesses in one country who trade with people in businesses in another country for mutual benefit. And sometimes, actually, trade agreements get in the way because what happens is that the trade negotiators become so focused on bargaining chips rather than actually just simply open up the market. A true free trade agreement would be a simple piece of paper that said, you open up your market, I'll open up mine. What we're actually talking about is something called preferential trade agreements, where we negotiate certain sectors and certain exceptions.
And do you think Britain would today be a different place had we not been part of the EU? How would it be different rather than do?
I mean, I think it's difficult to say where we would have been. There are some people who would say, actually, you know, we would have had this as Matt said, we would have been this Hong Kong, and we would have been a wonderful trade area. Others say, well, actually, we wouldn't have had that clout. The thing we forget when you are thinking about...
Your point was it was about companies, not about...
Yeah, exactly.
And in what way would companies be different?
Well...
And British manufacturing died in the 80s. I don't think that was because of trade agreements, was it? No,
I'm not saying that. But I think the thing we forget about is when you're talking about trade agreements, you're seeing countries as all sort of almost like billiard balls. People look at regime theory, talk about seeing countries as billiard balls. You're not looking at the internal dynamics. It very much depends on what sort of governments we had and whether they were more open to trade or not. Now, looking back at the fact that we had Conservative governments that were relatively more open trade, and actually New Labour particularly was very open trade, I think we would have seen trade to be very important to any British government over the last few years.
Stephen, you have a very practical role in dealing with some of the difficulties of trying to get, when you were in the Commission, trying to get 28 countries or 26 countries to agree. Can you just tell us about how it works? And is it the case that it's always going to go at the rate of the most protectionist country there?
The slowest wagon. Well, can I just go back to your very first question and provide an answer to it, which I think is conciser than anybody's sort of tried since, which is the counterfactual about what would have happened with Europe if we hadn't gone into Europe or if we didn't have the status quo. I mean, I think the reality is we would have tried to invent something like it, because I think that for Britain on the periphery of the European continent to have simply stayed outside of whatever was happening commercially or in the economic integration of the continent is simply unthinkable. We would have tried to come up with something that would have looked like EFTA or might look like the modern, something like the modern EU. We would have come, well, okay, but to answer your specific question, a British diplomat, who's now a very senior British diplomat in the Foreign Office, once said to me, foreign policy would be great if it wasn't for the foreigners. And I think that actually brings us to the nub of the point, which is what we're talking about here is not just our ability to make unilateral decisions about how we want to manage our own economy. It's our weight in shaping those decisions in others. And we're all going to use the expression trade-off again and again today, and it really always does come down to trade-offs. But my experience as a European trade policy maker is that it is unquestionably the case that the collective weight of the European Union is decisive in both getting trading partners to the table, which is actually, the important first step, and then ultimately in shaping our ability to shape a final outcome. And the most tangible example from my own career as a trade policy maker is Doha. Now, obviously, the WTO Doha Agreement collapsed in Geneva in 2008. But there's no question that it was the EU that was decisive in getting the agreement to the point at which, unfortunately, because of the intransigence of others, it did collapse. And I don't think, actually, that it was the case that the EU's position in that final end game was dictated by the slowest wagon in the EU caravan. I think, if anything, in fact, and again, I need to tread carefully, but I think that the slowest movers, particularly on agriculture, were consistently out manoeuvred by a Commission and a Council that were committed to an ambitious outcome. And there's no question that that means that there was an incredibly intense internal negotiation within the EU, and it's absolutely true that we spend as much time negotiating among ourselves as we do negotiating with our external partners. But does that mean that we get a lowest denominator outcome, in terms of the EU position? No, I don't think it does. And I think
how do you actually ensure that doesn't happen? Because clearly, sometimes the feeling outside that is what's going on.
Well, I think that's generally partly because we will focus on specific issues of contention, and that perhaps gives us the view that we are being pulled towards lowest denominator outcomes. But I mean, the mere fact that the Doha round was relaunched after Cancun, the mere fact that the G4 was convened, and that we actually came within a whisker of a final deal in 2008 is testimony to the fact that the overall caravan was moving faster than the slowest member of it would have liked. The way you do it, you invest immensely. I mean, you invest in the Commission. The Commission, I think, is absolutely key. I would agree with Mats when he said that he thinks that the current Commission is probably as liberal as any commission that we've ever had. I think one of the reasons for that is because of the disproportionate influence of British officials inside the Commission over the last 25 years, who have generally had a liberal mindset that both in competition policy, state aids policy and trade policy has translated into a commission that is comparatively economically liberal. And then, you practice what everybody practices in Brussels, which is effective diplomacy inside the Council. And again, my personal experience with this in 2008, the British delegation in Geneva was bigger than the Commission delegation in Geneva. And they were in every debate, in every discussion. They were twisting arms behind the scenes exactly as you'd expect. And they helped make sure, I think, that the centre of gravity in the Council was much higher than it would have been if it had simply been set at the level of the slowest mover. And I'm comparatively confident, to be honest, that the experience in TTIP, all things being equal, will be the same. I don't think there's any reason at all to suspect that we need to settle for moving at the speed of the slowest mover in the Council. Not least because European policy in almost every respect is a trade-off. Nobody just moves at the speed of the most reluctant or the slowest moving. There's always a compromise. Compromise doesn't necessarily mean, the worst possible outcome. Now,
I just want to check, does the panel agree, essentially, that the Commission is a liberal force within Europe on the trade side, or do you have a different view, William? I'm looking at you.
Well, I mean, I think it's highly arguable. I think the present Commissioner is interested in free trade, but it didn't stop him trying to start a trade war with China over the matter of solar panels. And it's actually an important point of precedent, this, which is that the Commissioner, off his own bat, against the wishes of 17 of the 28 member states, instituted penal tariffs on solar panels from China. So that doesn't sound very liberal to me. I think you look at what people do and not look at what and more than listening to what people say. So I think it's highly arguable.
Thank you.
I think you have to watch when you're defining what's liberal and what isn't. I mean, obviously, you don't want to encourage sort of dumping of products in Europe, and that's a very, very important part that the Commission plays. So we have to distinguish. We can't have practices which are completely anti-competitive allowed. Now, the solar thing may be slightly different, but I doubt it. But there have been so many cases of China doing these things in Europe, and quite often you can't actually detect it. And if it wasn't for the Commission, quite a lot of our industries in Europe would be suffering more than they are already.
And is the sort of the liberal aspect of the trading part of the Commission, is that institutionally entrenched, or is that just the way it has been over the past few years?
No, I think I do think it's entrenched. I think one of the realities about the Commission, with all due respect, is that it's a tenured system. People come up through it; they often work their entire career in it. DG Trade is currently led by a generation of trade negotiators who cut their teeth in trade negotiations in the 90s, in the early phase of the Doha round, when the intellectual environment global trade theory was very strongly biased towards liberalisation, and I think that there is still a very strong intellectual culture inside DG Trade that sees trade liberalisation as a good thing. There is no question, and I think Syed made this point, that other things have been imported into EU trade policy over the years, social, environmental factors. But there's my view, there is no question that the centre of gravity in DG Trade is still ultimately biased towards liberalisation and the benefits of liberalisation.
Now, just before we go on to what would happen if we left, one question for Syed. Just assuming we stay in but we have a renegotiation, and assuming that's possible, is there anything in the trade sphere that the Tories or your party would particularly like to see as part of that renegotiation?
No, I think actually, I mean, I can't say for definite what we'll be negotiating because we're still doing a balance of competence review to decide exactly what people agree on that we should be negotiating. But actually, I think, as many people said on the panel, that DG Trade, relative to the other DGs, is relatively liberal and actually open market. Even Pascal Lamy, a French socialist, was a relatively... he once said to me, Mr. Gamal, you mustn't talk about free trade, you must talk about open trade, because you get more people on your side that way. So even he understood it. But there are individuals, and this is what you've got to be very careful about when you sort of generalise about a country or a department or anything, or a DG. There are individuals, when it comes to individual trade negotiations, who I know are protectionist or are pushing a different agenda, which is sometimes protectionism over open trade. But overall, I think DG Trade, to be fair, is relatively liberal compared to, say, employment, or what we call DG unemployment, or environment, for example.
So that argues actually for close engagement, so that you know who's who, and Britain's interests can be fulfilled in that sense.
And that's the way European politics works. You have to you have to know who you're working with and build coalitions.
Right. So if it doesn't work, so we have a renegotiation, or we have after the balance of competencies review, we as the UK under a future Conservative or maybe coalition government decides to put it to a referendum, Britain votes to leave, what happens?
In terms of what happens with our relationship with the EU or trade? Right?
In trade.
Oh, trade, right, yeah. I think this is where we come to sort of counterfactual, and it's a matter of opinion. And I try and be as objective as I can in this, and try to take an academic view. I think Britain being the sort of 6th largest economy in the world, maybe the 7th by the time this happened, or depending on relative GDPs, there would be a number of countries that would want to sign trade agreements. Now, personally, I think the UK-US will take a bit of time, because it depends on internal politics. A Democrat administration and the State Department, as it is, would not want to sign one overnight. And I think that's a sort of pie in the sky to say the US would be knocking at our door for a UK-US. But actually, when you talk to Republicans, and for example, when I used to talk to people in the Bush administration, and Rubio was recently over here saying that he would, he understands if Britain left the EU. I think you would get a UK-US agreement depending on that internal regime. You wouldn't get a Commonwealth free trade area, but actually what you would get, you'd probably get individual UK Commonwealth countries trade agreements. I think the interesting one for us is what would the UK-EU trade agreement be. I think when it came to manufactured goods, clearly we are in deficit. In fact, when you take out invisibles, we are in deficit. They sell more to us than we sell to them, if you like. So there would be relatively easy to have a trade agreement. The interesting thing is services, because we are a leader in services, and it's particularly financial services, the area that I've been focusing on in the last few years. Why is it in the EU's interest, with Frankfurt driving Berlin and Paris driving Paris, to negotiate a trade agreement or an open agreement with the UK when it comes to financial services? And that will be the tricky question. Now, when I talk to the financial services sector in the City of London, Canary Wharf and parts of Mayfair, you get different voices. Some of them say to me, we like the single market. Please do not lose that single market in financial services for us. Others say to me, get the hell out of there. It is destroying our part of the business, hedge funds, private equity, bond traders and others. So it depends very much on who you talk to. And even individual companies have different views. There's a chairman of a very large insurance company, and he asked me how he should take part in this debate. And I said, don't get emotive about it. Don't try and throw in your politics too much into it. Otherwise, you could end up with the same sort of people who said it would be a disaster if we never joined the euro. because they've all been proven wrong and they've lost their credibility. Just say, in your view, how you think it would impact on your company. And he said to me, I think we'd lose about 1,000 jobs. So, well, OK, fair enough. How many new jobs do you think you would get as a result of new opportunities? He said, I can't say exactly, maybe a couple of hundred. I met his CEO and I asked him the very same question. And he said, 1,000 jobs, where did he get that number from? That's not a number I recognise. So even in individual companies, there's no agreement as to what the impact would be on financial services if we left.
I mean, you are one of London's MEPs, yes. And so you know this very well. Do you think there is sufficient additional business that Britain could do in the financial services sector, which is our biggest export, to make up for whatever we lost? And there would be some losses, because there are certainly particularly some foreign companies who base their European operations in London might feel they wanted to be inside the core of the EU. Sure. Is there enough of additional business that we can do externally to make up for those internal losses? Yeah, I mean, I can see there would be, but you could equally argue, because it's you're just it's sort of hypothetical here, or you're sort of theorising. People could say to me, well, actually, I don't see that, and this purely comes down to pure opinion. But trying to do it academically as opposed to politically, you can see opportunities. You can see Singapore being actually a real threat to London at the moment, and actually looking for some opportunities there. You can see other markets who eventually, as they move away from manufacturing and investors and try and set themselves up as investment hubs, look into the UK as well for our expertise. And people still respect the financial services industry in the UK. But it also very much depends on what sort of agreement we get with the EU as to how much of that we lose. Yeah. Vicky, give us the sort of I hate to say the sort of institutional British civil service view of what you think would happen, and whether the civil service could easily deal with actually arranging its own trading agreements, having devolved it to Brussels for 40 years.
Well, you're going to have many more civil servants, of course, dealing with that, so they'll be pleased from that point of view. But in reality, it's going to make life incredibly complicated. And it's not going to be much fun. But on the financial sector itself, if I may say something about that, I mean, it's really quite interesting, because most businesses I talk to, certainly financial sector companies too, say that if for some reason London lost its preeminent position as the financial centre in Europe, then things wouldn't move to anywhere else in Europe, they'd move to New York. And that's where most of the business would be dealt. We are, of course, talking here about sort of the wholesale financial side, which is global by now. And even though it's global and capital moves freely, in reality, one is still affected very significantly by changes in regulations across the world. So look what's happening in the US right now with the Volcker rule having gone through. Hedge funds are screaming because of the way it's going to be implemented and so on. So it is affecting quite a lot of our financial companies, despite the fact that, of course, we're talking about a completely unified, supposedly, financial sector, wholesale financial sector across the world. So similarly, of course, with whatever may be happening in Europe in that area, which we may not, in fact, be able to influence ourselves. So it is going to be much more difficult to think of the world financial markets as being sort of unified. That will affect trade. It will affect businesses' willingness to set up here or set up in places where they haven't got either the influence or they haven't got the ability to trade, freely in a particular jurisdiction. So whatever happens, the idea that we will be able to negotiate a financial agreement with the US that doesn't affect us is pie in the sky. It just won't happen. It will be much, much more difficult for us to do that, and they will see the opportunity to be themselves the even greater centre. So actually it would put us in a considerably weaker position to deal with that, with any of that in the future.
Yeah, you said right at the start it'd be more complicated and not much fun, and then you just ended saying, why is that? Why is it? What is the real complication and the difficulty of leaving the EU in the trading sphere?
Well, first of all, whether we need to do anything directly with Europe, of course, in itself, depending, of course, what sort of agreement we may have. So everything is possible. We may have a sort of Norwegian or Swiss relationship, and that needs to be negotiated. Then, of course, with the Norwegian case, you add all sorts of other things, with the Swiss case as well, so you need to be constantly be on the lookout for this. The second thing, of course, is that you need to be negotiating deals with individual countries yourself. I mean, the interesting thing about having a Europe, which is unified in the trade front at least, because of the way, of course, the single market has moved, is that you have common standards, you have the agreement to be able to sell things across Europe much more easily, which of course very often becomes the international standard. That cuts costs to businesses. It just makes life much, much more difficult if you don't have that, and you have to start negotiating directly with individual countries in terms of what types of goods you can or cannot import or export to each other. And that, of course, adds cost to businesses. And that's what the ultimate issue is.
Well, of course, you wouldn't have the same negotiations you have to go to in Brussels, where you're putting Britain's interest within Europe, because that would be cleaner, though, wouldn't it?
Well, perhaps, but again, look at how many people are involved in this. Of course, businesses have to go around and lobby Brussels, but otherwise they will have to go around and lobby every country in Europe. It just makes life considerably more difficult for everyone. And the main benefit of being in the EU is that it cuts this transaction costs, if you like. And you can deal with things a lot more easily. And being out of that and having to do it yourself makes it A, harder, and B, the result is bound to be suboptimal.
William, give us your vision of Britain outside Europe and how much better it would be in the trade sphere. What would be the real gains?
Well, I know that you don't want this discussed, but it would mean that instead of 100% of our economy being subject to EU regulations, only that proportion of our economy accounted for by exports to the EU, which is 10%. And incidentally, the trend is that it's going down.
We'd be outside the single market, in your view, as well.
Well, hang on. If China wants to export goods to... China exports, as I said, 248,000 million euros worth of goods to the EU, and those goods which they export are subject to EU single market rules. But the rest of the Chinese economy isn't, and that is the point. And these rules are highly job destructive, as Dr. Kamal mentioned too, because you had to put up with all the employment rules, you had to put up with the Working Time Directive, which even Tony Blair said was the worst piece of legislation that was possible to imagine. The Temporary Agencies Directive, and of course we're not even allowed to be able to have the light bulbs which we want. But I'll just make one lightning point. City of London, the entire political establishment, the CBI, Peter Mandelson, all the usual suspects, predicted that if Britain did not enter the euro, the City of London would would completely lose its role as the world's #1 financial centre. And the usual suspects are saying the same, frankly, who've been proved demonstrably wrong before,
on this panel is
are
saying
now
this.
saying the same thing over again. Should we leave the EU?
We're trying to keep this panel as a not to get into the sort of sloganising.
But I'm entitled to mention as an academic point.
Sure, knocking down strawmen
This was predicted about the euro. So when the same people make the same predictions, should we leave the EU, one is entitled to be, let us say, a little bit sceptical about it. Now, two further lightning academic points. Russia. The Soviet Union stopped becoming a country and was in a way substituted by a smaller country, which was Russia. All the Soviet Union's trade agreements were inherited by Russia. That is what happened. And the other precedent which exists is Greenland. Greenland did leave the EU. What happens to its trade? It immediately, within 2 years, which is the time frame that we're talking about, it made a trade agreement with the EU. Except I don't think it was actually the EU then, covering fishing products, which accounted for 60% of its exports. So the precedents indicate that we would be able to make a deal, and if Greenland can make a deal, why shouldn't we?
And the deal with the EU, I'm sure we would make a deal. What's our negotiating position? What's the negotiating position you would want?
What makes our negotiating position very, very strong is that we have a continuing and massive trade deficit with the EU, which the cumulative trade deficit is the incredible figure of 438 billion sterling. Now, it's not a good thing for us as a country, that we have such a big trade deficit with the EU, bearing in mind that we pretty much run a trade surplus with the rest of the world. But the fact that this trade deficit does significantly augment our negotiating position.
So you think
the fact is, they need us more than we need them.
You think because if we're talking about companies, you'd think the head of Volkswagen, for example, would be quaking in his boots that Britain wouldn't import any more cars if we didn't get a deal, and that would give us a strong negotiating hand.
Well, you accuse me of using hyperbole. I think the phrase "quaking in his boots" is a bit hyperbole. But if we can return to the context of an academic discussion, it would actually clearly be, you know, a minus and not a plus if we stopped importing cars. But nobody is suggesting that. Nobody is suggesting that.
In a second, Stephen.
Nobody is suggesting that except for.
Well, can I make a point about, and I think this goes back in some ways to what Syed said in opening, about the role of regulation in trade as trade actually happens in the second decade of the third millennium. I wouldn't contest for a minute that we would be able to agree some kind of FTA with the rest of the European Union. I'm sure that would happen, and I imagine that despite some probably fairly rude politics, it would happen comparatively quickly. I think what we need to think about is the distinction between an FTA is a snapshot of a trading relationship at a moment in time, and it freezes that trading relationship at that point in time and puts a ratchet in the level of openness that exists at that point in time. And in a world in which most trade or most protectionism takes the form of tariffs, that can be exceptionally valuable. And one of the things the WTO does, or has tried to do, is to put a ratchet in the unilateral liberalization of tariff profiles that have gone on over the last 2 decades. It stops it going backwards by signing it into WTO law. So an FTA is incredibly valuable if tariffs are your problem. If your problem is the kind of regulation that gets in the way of services trade, you have a much more nuanced and subtle problem. And what you really need is something closer to a living agreement, a living arrangement that allows you over time to track and block changes in regulation. And that is the difference between the relationship we and Norway currently have with the EU and which we wouldn't have in an FTA situation. And that we are at least, we are much more than Norway, actually at the table. We are helping to shape regulatory outcomes in real time. And it's that living agreement function of the EU for a services trader like us, I think, that's key. And it's what would not be replicated if we had an FTA arrangement. And it's one of the big challenges, for example, with the TTIP. The TTIP is largely focused on services sectors, services trade, because we have almost no tariffs between the EU and the US. But the question of how we make it a living agreement, how we make it more than something that is just simply signed on one day in time and that essentially then, set in aspic, is a really big challenge. And we would have the same challenge with the EU if we were outside and looking to re-establish a purely FTA relationship, I think.
And William's point is essentially that the regulatory outcomes that we've managed to achieve in the living agreement we currently have isn't very good for Britain.
Well, there are, of course, you can, of course, cite examples where we feel that the regulatory balance inside Europe is not where we would want it to be. Does that trump the fact that British businesses ultimately still only have to deal with one set of regulation at the European level rather than 28? I'll defer to Vicky on that, but I suspect probably not.
Where do you sit on the sort of Vicky's point that it would be the additional complication of being outside would be a real and significant cost?
I don't know. I take a more practical point of view, which is that resources and time in our trading partners are finite. And if they have a list of people with whom they want to sit down, what is to say that just because we're keen and bushy-tailed in London, that they will be sitting on the other side of the table? And I think it's particularly relevant in an environment where, for example, in ASEAN or in the Pacific area, where there is a very strong kind of mega-regional dynamic that is pulling the TPP states, and the APEC states away from engagement with, if anything, engagement with Europe. It's an even bigger question how Europe keeps them focused on us. And the idea that we, as Britain, would do a better job than a market of 550 million doesn't seem very convincing to me. So, I agree with Vicky, but I think there's almost a kind of prior practical point, which is that, the bureaucracies with which we negotiate have finite time and resources. And they have a bigger proposition in the States, they have a bigger proposition in APEC. What's going to make them want to sit down opposite the UK?
Vicky, you wanted to come back on some of the things William was saying earlier.
Oh, no, it was, I was just thinking about our deficit, and I was just going to make the point, and assuming I've got my data right, that I think we export more cars to Europe than Italy produces right now. So it's not all one way, and it's actually been quite a good success story in many areas. That's all.
Well, sorry, just on cars. If you look at the statements made by Jaguar and Land Rover and other car manufacturers, and indeed for the Eurozone as a whole, it's what the Chancellor said in the autumn statement. He said the problem we have is the flatlining in the Eurozone, and the fact of the matter is that the famous Ed Balls gesture, which we've seen lots of times on television if ever we watch Parliamentary Questions, doesn't apply to the UK economy, but it does apply to the Eurozone economies, or that is to say that the 17 countries in the Eurozone.
Yeah, I just want to make a small point on something Stephen said, because one of the questions I often ask when I go around the world meeting officials, for example, when I was in Japan, when I've been in other countries that we are, I'm working on trade agreements in the Parliament on, is that I do ask the question. I said, can I just ask you, what would happen if Britain did leave the EU? What sort of relationship would you see with us? And it's interesting because actually, on the whole, they'll say to us something like, we'd rather you didn't leave, but actually, we're pragmatic, we're politicians, or we're negotiators, and we would deal with you as we would with any other country. So I think to say that people, I know you're not saying this, you're saying that they wouldn't necessarily be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and chomping at the bit to negotiate, but actually they would still be a willingness. They would prefer us to stay in, but actually they've said to me that they would be pragmatic about it, and they would deal with, as most politicians and negotiators do, you deal with the way the world is, not the way you want it to be.
Now, just before we open this to the floor, so we have a nice, good time for questions, there was one thing that Mats Persson said right at the beginning was it was the mass and clout. One of the trade-offs was the mass and clout of being part of a global trading bloc. That was one of the big advantages. And I don't think we've quite addressed this on the panel. I don't know, Stephen, do you think that is actually important and it really does help the UK?
Yes. I mean, obviously, I think, there's no question we get listened to. Our view has weight. I mean, again, I come back to my own personal experience. The G4, which was the negotiating constellation that was created to try and clinch the Doha round in 2007, the EU, the US, India and Brazil. Would the UK have been in that constellation if it was out, if it was out with the EU? No. There's no question that we were at that table because we were part of the EU. And I am sure that in the preponderance of examples, it is the EU's collective weight that is fundamentally attractive to our trading partners, irrespective of what they might say to a politician like Saeed when he asks them if they would still be friends with the UK.
I'm not friends, but they want to negotiate a trade agreement with us.
But would they commit the same level of resource? Would they bring to the table the same level of ambition in trying to deliver a trading deal? Would the Canadians, the Canadians have spent the last 6 years trying to get the EU over the line on CETA. Would they have done the same if they were dealing bilaterally with the UK?
It might well have been a quicker agreement, though, actually, a UK-Canada agreement.
Possibly.
When you think about what holds up the CETA.
But when you think that Ottawa had to spend a lot of political capital trying to get the provinces over the line, would they have done that if the prize was just the UK? I say not.
Well, I think that's just profoundly wrong. The fact of the matter is that talking about EU trade agreements, and Dr. Kamal, I think, alluded to this earlier on, is that what the politicians do, who have much too much influence, is they try and tack on a lot of extraneous stuff onto trade agreements, which doesn't affect trade, which has got nothing or very little to do with trade.
Would
so,
British
for instance, the Canada trade agreement... No, the politicians in the European Parliament and the European politicians. So, for instance, the Canada trade agreement was nearly killed because of concerns about tar sands and seals. Well, these are probably very good and legitimate areas of concern, but not in the context of a trade agreement. Also, bear in mind that we actually had a trade agreement with Canada until 1975, which derived from the Ottawa agreements. And if I must just say, there is one point which is terribly, terribly important, is that the G8, the last G8, the G8 that was in Northern Ireland, you may remember that Barroso and Van Rompuy, representing respectively the President of the European Commission and the President and the permanent President of the European Council, attended. And the basic is exactly the other way around from what the panelists at the other end said, is basically our attendance at the G8 is under threat because the logic is that we're represented by the President of the Commission, the President of the EU Council, and that potentially is the way that it's going.
It is clearly true that they were there at the G8. My experience of covering various G8 events is they're entirely ignored in those circumstances.
Well, they've got very good judgment then, because they're covered completely ludicrous people, as Nigel has said on many occasions.
I want us to make a very small point, actually, or illustration that kind of, I think, illustrates